Hi, I'm James Ford, and I am one of the teachers with our Empty Moon Zen Collaborative. Today, I'm going to share a few thoughts that I've been kicking around for a while on Stoicism and Zen. There I was, out on the interwebs once again, wandering around, when my social media feed offered a meme featuring a quote attributed to Marcus Aurelius. It goes, "Meditate often on the interconnectedness and mutual interdependence of all things in the universe." I thought, oh my. I'm deeply interested in the varieties of what is perhaps best called non-dual religion. That intuition of a deep and intimate connection among things. And that line, meditate often on the interconnectedness and mutual interdependence of all things in the universe. That's a rather powerful summation of the non-dual, along with an invitation to find it for oneself, I noticed. I continue to find the Zen way the clearest of the paths into our intimate experience of what our tradition calls not one, not two. However, and this is another truth not to be ignored, Zen is a human project. Therefore, it isn't always right. We always need to be careful about the traps of certainty, our own most of all, but also of our traditions. And as my old koan teacher John Tarrant once observed, the way gets really dangerous as our ideas of what is get closer to what is. The best way I found to push against the boundaries of my certainties, again, my own most of all, but those of my tradition as well, has been to explore some of those other traditions that also claim non-dual insight. They can provide corroboration, challenge, and on occasion, even correction. This quote very much touched me as a grand example of another way into the non-dual. So, first, it's on the interwebs and a meme. And so I asked my friend Doug Bates, who knows a lot about such things, if this quote was actually real. And if so, what was the source? Doug responded to me actually quickly, and I was very grateful. And he said, it's a very modernized but reasonable looking translation. He added, it's in the Meditations, book 6, chapter 38, and he pointed me to the Gregory Hayes modern translation of that passage. Keep reminding yourself of the way things are connected, of their interrelatedness. All things are implicated in one another, are in sympathy with each other. This event is the consequence of some other one. Things push and pull on each other and breathe together and are one. Curious to know a bit more, I looked up one of the so-called standard translations, this one from Francis Long. Frequently consider the connection of all things in the universe and their relation to one another. For, in a manner, all things are implicated with one another, and all in this way are friendly to one another. I love that, are friendly to one another. For one thing comes in order after another, and this is by virtue of the active movement and mutual conspiración and the unity of the substance. A bunch of years ago, the blogger and Unitarian Universalist thinker Doug Mooter wrote a sermon called, "Is There a Western Path to Enlightenment?" I like that, of course, because of the Enlightenment thing. It particularly captured me. Now, he suggested there is, and he concluded that that path is Stoicism. In fact, Stoicism isn't the only candidate from among Greek antiquity as a possible modern Western path to awakening. My old friend Doug Bates, who identified that quote, in addition to being a many-year committed Zen practitioner, has himself spent the last couple of years advocating for Pyrrhonism as a neo-Buddhist path for moderns. It might be worth investigating, but that's just a note. For me, right now, it's Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics that I'm finding so interesting. And he and they are what I think might be useful for us here today, gathered as we are in a community of Zen practice. Here's the deal in short. We're alive. We know we will die. Real religions deal with this. All of them. Not all do it well. Some actually have elaborate schemes designed to protect the ego. Well, not the ego in some abstract way. Your ego. My ego. Aitken Roshi once dryly observed how many religions take people to heavens or hells. He meant that many religions reinforce the tragic view that we are separate from the world. Although I notice the mature versions, even of those religions, always have a minority report that non-dual thing. Here's the secret to all the religions that avoid the traps and see into the intimate. The art is learning to let our clinging to our egos go. In other words, to die. The Sufis even have a phrase for this, learning to die before we die. And within the apparent conundrum of the real, out of that, learning to live. To put it another way, authentic spirituality is learning to fall. As that most complicated Tibetan teacher Chogyam Trungpa once said, the bad news is you're falling through the air. Nothing to hang on to. No parachute. The good news is there is no ground. Zen Buddhism offers a way to learn how to fall. It is amazing. It really works. And as I noted, it isn't the only way. Doug Mutter started his sermon with the observation how, quote, there's a classic story that gets acted out in reality every few years. It goes like this. A young adult, typically male, grows up in the center of civilization, typically England. He has a certain measure of success and he comes to be quite proud of himself. And then he goes off to an apparently backward part of the world, typically India, where he finds ancient teachings that wake him up spiritually. End quote. Doug cites some of the more famous examples, like Kipling's classic novel Kim, to the Beatles studying with the Maharishi. Of course, I've taken that journey myself, and I've found Taoist and Zen Buddhist advice on learning to fall. Good advice, words I've learned from, along with practices that work. But I'm haunted by that something else that Doug said. How, quote, as much as I admire and even envy some of the Eastern or indigenous religions, I'm a Westerner. The West is not just where my body happened to be born. It is the home of my soul. My Zen is inevitably in some way going to be a Western Zen. I'm deeply grateful for what I've received. I've spent a lifetime bowing into the practices and the teachings. And to my bones, I'm a child of the West. Here, not only are we invited into the odd correction to the mistakes of our given tradition of practice, so important as that is, but actually even into something potentially more intimate. I believe Doug's point is an invitation into continuing clarity. From, I believe, that perspective, Doug then goes on to offer some words from the Stoics that might be more accessible to many of us in the West. I know, even as a lifelong practitioner of Zen, I find turning to Western wisdom fills a need, some deep, visceral need. So, I feel the resonances, and with Doug Mutter and Doug Bates and increasing others, I think we can profit greatly from attending to the Stoics and other Greek philosophers and their wisdoms as an aside, the Jewish and Christian and Islamic traditions as well. Much wisdom there. I'm currently on a project digging into the Psalms, but right now, the Stoics. It's a wisdom just as profound as we can find in the East, and a good example of how with humility, key phrase there, with humility, we can learn and find more signposts on our own way into the great tumble in the sky. Perhaps no parachute, but even better, finding what our relation is to that sky that we're falling through. Although, just like with Zen, we need to start by saying much of what we probably think Stoicism is probably wrong. For most of us, being Stoic is sucking it up, finding that stiff upper lip, and gutting through whatever the presenting situation might be. Sort of the moral equivalent to the most popular understanding of that word, Zen, as meaning somewhat detached and cool. This sucking it up and gutting through Stoicism isn't actually a new way of thinking about the tradition. Someone who did the research found that very usage dating from the middle of the 16th century. Nonetheless, I suggest such a view of Stoicism is missing the great gift to Western spirituality that this ancient Greek and its Roman versions of spiritual insight in fact offer. Stoicism is about learning to fall in a world where we're all falling. Turns out the Stoics emphasized three things. The first was virtue. Think of the Tao Te Ching, virtue of the way, a way of discerning what to avoid and what to embrace in our lives. The second was wisdom, again, I think prajna, often called reason in Greek and Latin, which, while including rational thought, is mainly about a larger perspective that is found not through the accumulation of knowledge, but rather through careful attention to what one thinks and holds in the mind. And the third is a view of the rhythms of nature, the Dharma, discerning its patterns and laws. Each of these is worthy of detailed study, complete with all those hints, corrections, angles, the whole schmear. Now, what surprised me was how these concerns each involve spiritual practices. For me, this was a surprise because I've long felt the major lack in the West has been such actual hands-on, try this and you'll find your way, pointers to our own individual depth. But here they were. For instance, Doug Mooter describes attention to character as a Stoic spiritual discipline. He cites the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who wrote, quote, "The mind must be called to account every day. This is what Sextus used to do. At the close of the day, when he retired to his nightly rest, he used to pose questions to his mind. What fault of yours have you cured today? What defects have you resisted? In what way are you better?" Doug goes on to describe how he has adapted this as a personal spiritual discipline. Now, I want to pause for a second there, because sometimes when Zen people talk about spiritual traditions that are less than the actual push into awakening, they get dismissed, and sometimes it's in fact, I've seen several people just say it becomes Methodism, and I don't know why the poor Methodists get tagged with that, except that Wesley himself was, paid attention to this aspect of this, of character development, the path of character as a really important aspect. But even for him, it wasn't the bottom line, but it's definitely a facet, and a critical facet. I find myself thinking of Zen's precepts and how this approach can fold into our own practices in very healthy and helpful ways, considering how we've done with precepts or the lack thereof. Inspired, I found several essays and references to books that describe Stoic spiritual disciplines, most all of which seemed likely useful to anyone gathered here today. Just Google Stoic and spiritual. I suggest it'll be worth your trouble. Sadly, most of the details of Stoic spiritual practices have, in fact, actually been lost. At the same time, there is much still accessible hints and pointers, and as I see it, with a little fill-in from the wisdoms of the East, particularly the disciplines of stopping and watching, that we have learned, I think we may well be on our way to enriching our paths into the deep, learning new angles on the great fall. There really is nothing quite like sitting down, shutting up, and paying attention, with the addendum about that paying attention part to let the things of the world come to you rather than chasing after them. Chasing, we give them names of our own devising. Letting them come to us, they give us their names. And at the same time reveal our common family name. As a Zen meditator, I was most taken with what I found about Stoic concern with attention to the mind's workings and how it appears so like my own practices. All of the essays concerned with Stoic attention seem to point to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his small book Meditations. Just aside, I like that Marcus Aurelius is their guy. He's an emperor. He did bad things. Christians don't like him. He thought them annoying and did have some persecutions. And he killed people. And look at the Meditations, particularly the 12th book and its 3rd chapter, the summation perhaps of the whole Stoic way. Here's a version of that text translated by Arthur Spencer Lote Farquharson from the first half of the 20th century. There are 3 things of which you are compounded: body, vital spirit, mind. 2 of these are your own insofar as you must take care of them, but only the 3rd is in the strict sense your own. So, if you separate from yourself, namely from your mind, all that others do or say, all that you yourself did or said, all that troubles you in the future, all that as part of the bodily envelope or natural spirit attaches to you without your will, and all that the eternal circumfluent vortex whirls around, so that your mind power, freed from the chain of necessity, lives purified and released by itself, doing what is just, willing what comes to pass, and speaking what is true. If you separate, I say, from this governing self that is attached to it by sensibility and what of time is hereafter or has gone by, and make yourself like the sphere of Empedocles, rounded, rejoicing in the solitude which is about it, and practice only to live the life you are living, that is the present, then you will have it in your power at least to live out the time that is left until you die, untroubled and with kindness and reconciled with your own good spirit. In order to own it a little more and to be owned by it a little more, I sat quite a while with several translations, particularly Pierre Hadot's modern version. Then, after a while, I attempted my own creative adaptation. Yes, I do understand the limitations of such a project, particularly the limitations from not reading Greek, and how, of necessity, I project my own life into the text. On the other hand, this discipline of making my own translation, or perhaps better, version, invites intimacy, and I felt myself shifting and being transformed by the text, even at the same time as I was shifting and transforming it. Opening my heart as well as my mind, something happened. Whatever the details, this discipline of making a text one's own is arguably a Stoic spiritual practice. At least according to one source I found. It looks a little bit like Lectio Divina as well, so others do this. Perhaps you'll try your own version sometime. Now, we're rolling into the end of our time together, so let me share my little attempt, my paraphrase. I think it might even be the most important thing I share with you today. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and philosopher, guides us toward the God within. Quote, "You are composed of three things: body, breath, and mind. The first two are yours to the degree that you are responsible for their care. Only the third is truly yours. If you do not attach your sense of who you are to your thoughts, to what others say or do, to what you have said or done, to what you will say or do, to the vicissitudes of your health and other physical conditions, to any of the raging currents of your life beyond your control, so that your mind is not entangled by those things that pass away, you will dwell in freedom and become the master of your house, making all your actions just, doing everything mindfully and living truthfully. If you live mindfully without clinging to any thought of bodily condition or the future or the past, and become like Empedocles' globe, perfectly contained and joyful, and strive to live only the life you have in this moment, then you will own your life up until the time of your death, marked by wisdom and joy, at one with the God within." So, here's the deal. Here's the invitation. With attention, with recollection of our lives, and with finding our genuine relationships within the world that is, we find a way of wisdom. That is what I suggest we're about as Western practitioners of Zen Buddhism, and what I see that Stoicism is about. And something more, how Stoicism can help us find our own authentic Western way. I don't see Stoicism or other Greek philosophies as supplanting Zen or Christianity or Judaism or Islam, for that matter. Zen is too clear and offers such a powerful basket of practices. But it's also obvious all religions are false to one degree or another. All are limited by the human minds that have created them. And so, having a wide gaze is wise. With that, taking wisdom where we find it is prudent. And, well, here's an angle on what can be very helpful. Here we are, from the moment of our birth falling. The only question is, how do we fall? Artfully, healthfully, joyfully. Well, our Western spiritual ancestors, the Stoics, tell us by seeing through the great mess, by not grasping at things that pass, but rather by holding with open hands, by noticing, we discover our hearts open. We discover joy. And we can find a way of life that can be called wise. Sound familiar? Learning to fall, awakening in the West, awakening in Zen, the intimate way.